Hello, I'm Thomas Marshall Hill, and I'm here today to talk to you about enclosures that are built below the base flood elevation and how they relate to the National Flood Insurance Program. Um, Homes can be built or structures can be built below the base flood elevation, but they have to be built in a certain way. As you can see from this picture, the bottom floor of this home uh, was damaged due to these flood waters. Um, you can do certain things to areas built below the base flood elevation, as you can see from this home built on the beach. The area below, I'm assuming we'll say this is the base flood elevation for just reference. Below that, there's certain things you can do. You can park cars. You can use it for ingress and egress of the facility. There's probably some stairways in here, and you can also use it for storage. So this area could be used for storage, but they also have to be built under certain conditions and certain criteria. So what does that matter? What does that matter to us? Well, your insurance premiums are going to be based on the elevation of your home or lowest floor as it relates to the base flood elevation. This one you can see where this home was built 4 foot below the base flood. Annual premiums are $9,500. The insurance company saying, hey, this house is going to flood, so I got to charge more. I got to cover my costs. This house was built at the base flood elevation, so the premiums go to $1,410 a year. So the insurance company is saying that, I'm going to have to pay, but not it's going to be as much, so I don't have to collect as much to make up for what it's going to cost me to fix the home when it's damaged. The next one is built 3 foot above the base flood elevation. The insurance company says, all right, annual premiums only $427. Now, where does those enclosures come into play? Or the base flood elevation and the minimum floor is dependent on what is the minimum floor. If for some reason, if you see this home here, this basement or this enclosure below was built not to standards, then what an insurance company do, the National Flood Insurance Program would consider is now the base flood elevation is still here, but the minimum floor is going to be below that. Or instead of being 3 foot above, it's going to be wherever this is. Right? So it would be defeat the purpose of raising the home if you do something here that does not meet those standards. And we're going to go over some of those standards now. Right? What are a couple of things you have to do? Well, if you have an enclosure, that enclosure needs to have openings that let the water flow freely in and out of it. What's the reason for that? Well, let's say you have a flood and the water builds up to here and you don't have these openings and you don't have water in here. Well, you get a lot of water pressure, hydrostatic pressure built up here that could push the wall in. The other thing that could happen is if that water comes up, let's say really slowly, and stays up for a while, and you don't have these openings, well, it's going to eventually leak into there. And then if you have water on the outside falls rapidly, like if you live along a river, now you have this water pressure on the inside that could push out on the wall and can cause damage. Another requirement is you have to have at least 2 openings per enclosure. And what's the reason for that? Most of the time when water rises for flooding, it rises from one side. Right? And when it rises, it brings debris with it. So let's say you had these 2 openings on this side, and the water started rising and it clogged these up because the debris was coming from this way. Well, then no water would be able to enter this part, and you'd get those differential hydrostatic pressures. So the requirement is you have to have 2 openings, and one has to be on separate walls. I'll have one on this wall, and let's say one over here, which just lessens the chance of debris filling up. Another thing is these openings, the size of those openings at a minimum has to be 1 square inch per every square foot of wall, which that just tells you, let you know at a minimum how many openings am I going to have for that enclosure. All right. Another requirement is the opening has to be below the base flood elevation, which only makes sense. I mean, the reason for the opening is to relieve those hydrostatic pressures on the wall, if the opening was up here above the water, it wouldn't serve any purpose. So it has to be below the base flood elevation, and it has to be at a minimum uh, uh, or at a maximum 1 foot above natural ground. Right. So what would happen is, let's say your base flood elevation was down here at 6 inches, then this opening would need to be down here below the base flood elevation. No more than a foot, but it also has to be below the base flood elevation. Right. Most of these openings, people try to keep rodents and animals from coming in, people from coming in, so they put grates on those, some kind of frame. But what you have to be careful is it doesn't cause problems when you have a flood and debris builds up against it. For instance, this one you can see clogged up, but the holes are so large they're not keeping animals or rodents out, and they're so small. You could have probably taken out, this owner could have taken out every other one of these still, and would have stopped that debris from collecting, and would have also served its intended purpose of keeping individuals from coming through there. All right, in conclusion, you can build an enclosure below a base flood elevation, but it has to meet certain criteria. Right? It has to have enough openings to allow the water to flow freely. There are different ways to do that. I didn't cover them in this presentation because there's too many of them, and they have to have a certain number and a certain height. The main thing is, if you decide to do that, make sure you consult the requirements. So what you don't want to do is build an enclosure and defeat the purpose of raising a home above the base flood elevation. Thank you.